Infrastructure is already shaping up as a major election issue. The government is trumpeting its nation-building credentials, while the opposition leader Tony Abbott says he wants to be known as an infrastructure prime minister. But Australia is facing an infrastructure backlog of $700 billion. In a moment, we'll be talking to Brendan Lyon from Infrastructure Partnerships Australia. But first, this report from Neil Woolridge.
There's gridlock on the roads, public transport is packed, schools and hospitals are overcrowded, and good luck getting a plane that runs on time.
If we have congestion that stops our produce being taken to market, if we have ports that are fighting for each other, we will slip in our economy. So investment is absolutely critical.
By some estimates, Australia has an infrastructure backlog of $700 billion, an amount that's almost half our annual GDP. The latest figures published by the peak lobby group Infrastructure Partnerships Australia show a downward trend in not just mining but also non-mining projects as well, and civil construction work has fallen to its lowest level since the survey began.
So yes, the sum of money required is large, and so we have to collectively be very particular in what we invest our money on to make sure that we invest in the right parts first.
The government's own body, Infrastructure Australia, has recently updated its priority list for Australian projects, which includes the Pacific Highway upgrade, Brisbane's Cross River Rail and Melbourne's Metrolink Rail. It's also proposing an action plan to establish a single national infrastructure fund, encourage more private investment and adopt more user pay arrangements.
The acid test is, can they readily be funded? And I think, whether it's in the court of public opinion as to what people are really prepared to pay for, or the court of commercial opinion and what the private sector is prepared to finance, that's really what, I guess, acts as a helpful sorting hat.
In April, a consortium of super funds paid $5 billion for 99-year leases of Port Botany and Port Kembla, and the New South Wales government will use that money to fund other infrastructure. However, deals like that are a rarity.
We have been ready to invest a lot more than we have, but it's been deal flow. There hasn't been sufficient number of deals facilitated by governments, mainly state governments.
There's still opportunity for us.
Colin Duffield says new arrangements are being developed to help unlock superannuation savings where projects are on-sold to funds after the upfront construction risk is out of the way.
Superannuation funds find investment in new construction quite difficult because of the inherent risks involved. They'd rather see an ongoing stream of operating capital or operating revenue that they can say we're doing the right thing for our investors, which is in fact their charter.
Sovereign wealth funds and foreign pension funds have also invested in Australian infrastructure over the years, but Pottinger's Nigel Lake says it's a highly competitive global market to attract that money.
If we can move reasonably quickly and it brings sensible projects to market that the private sector wants to finance, then we can access that pool of money, which is currently available on quite attractive terms.
So time is of the essence to make sure Australia makes best use of the low interest rate environment and the strong credit ratings of both the federal and state governments.
Neil Woolridge with that report. So to drill down a little more on what can be done in infrastructure, I'm joined by the head of Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, Brendan Lyon. Brendan, welcome.
Good to be with you.
Now, there we have the Leader of the Opposition up in Mackay today, promising $6.75 billion for the Bruce Highway. Of course, politics is the art of the possible, but that would be a good fillip for infrastructure, wouldn't it?
Look, I think it's a very welcome announcement. I think the focus that we're seeing out of both government and opposition in terms of state-based infrastructure priorities is a very good focus for the nation. But what we really need to see is Canberra, in the context of the national election that's coming up, we really need to see policymakers in Canberra having a real and rational discussion about how can we materially change the funding mix for infrastructure.
Yeah, we've just been hearing in that piece of Neil's a $700 billion backlog, according to some people. Paint a picture for us, if you will, about just where we are with investment.
Look, I think by almost any measure that you see across the economy, Australia is falling short, whether it's urban congestion, it's the price of electricity, the price of moving goods and services through the economy. I think everybody would agree that there is a shortfall in terms of infrastructure, that we're not directing the investment towards the best possible uses, and more particularly we don't have the level of funding available that we need to get some of these mega projects up and out of the ground.
We had a lot in mining, and I note from your papers that actually in terms of work being done, that's going to tick on quite well, but in terms of work won, that's falling rapidly, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we're really facing a very difficult situation, and the lead-in pieces spoke to it quite succinctly, but we're facing a problem where the privately funded mining investment is coming off, and we're not seeing publicly funded or public infrastructure projects take up that slack. And that's not because we don't need new projects. It's not because there's a lack of appetite in the public or the business sector to see these projects delivered. It's fairly and squarely because governments don't have the funding capacity that's needed to get these projects done.
So this is not necessarily a private sector, it's not the private sector not getting off its behind, it's actually a public sector issue.
Look, it's a public funding issue that's the problem, that's holding back projects from moving through the market.
In what way? What would you like to see?
Well, I mean, most of the infrastructure that needs to be delivered doesn't come with a revenue stream directly to it. It's why there's an asymmetry between superannuation and the backlog of infrastructure that's talked about. Either governments have to create markets where you can get private investment flowing into these projects, or else
you
they
mean
require...
like an electricity privatisation?
Like creating the national electricity market, or looking at water markets. But where government remains the principal provider of services, or where it's not economic for individual projects to fund themselves, then the budget is where it's funded from. And the problem is that we've seen governments routinely spending more than they earn. And it means that state governments in particular are up against their AAA head ratings with no flexibility. The Commonwealth remains the only jurisdiction with substantial headroom. So I think we need to see a much more ambitious and optimistic debate between the major parties about how they can leverage it, and they can start to get some of these very important projects that will underpin future economic growth out into the market and delivered.
Privatisation does seem to be a key part of this. I know you've pushed for a New South Wales electricity privatisation, but we did get some success with port privatisation in New South Wales.
Look, I think the approach that New South Wales has taken over the last couple of years has been a very sensible one, where they've stepped the public through the case for why things need to change, why assets need to be sold. They've been very upfront about how that money will be applied to the infrastructure backlog. And so we're seeing much less of a public furor than we did, say, a few years ago when New South Wales was considering the sale of its electricity generators. What we've got to remember is that voters at the end of the day have to manage their household incomes. They understand that you can't routinely spend more than you earn and expect to be able to buy a new car.
So when you're talking about, for example, civic construction, the road, the railways, we are looking much more at a user pays type model, aren't we?
Look, user pays has got a tremendous role to play in getting many of these things done, and that's really where we need to see the national policy debate starting to focus on some of the long-run reforms that will materially drive up the level of investment, materially drive the allocation of capacity across the networks we've got.
So how important is it for the public to be on side? I mean, I'm looking, for example, the UK at the moment with their HS2, their high-speed rail, and that's becoming an absolute debacle. It's got a big cost overrun to it now, and it's losing public support. Is it very important to get public support?
Look, I think that you want the public supporting the general direction that's being taken. You're always going to have noise about big projects, about big reforms, about the sale of existing assets and all of the rest, but ultimately I think that the business community and the broader community expect to see leadership on infrastructure and broader economic policy. I think people understand that we can't endlessly borrow to pay wages, but it is quite legitimate to borrow to fund your capital investment task as long as it's going into the right sort of projects.
And finally, what about foreign investment? I mean, we've seen, for example, the Canadian pension funds coming over and sniffing around. I mean, there certainly is demand there, isn't there?
Look, there is a huge amount of interest from investors both in Australia and offshore for access to our assets. Australia's ultimately ended up in a similar situation to Stephen Bradbury, our ice skater. The rest of the world's fallen over, and so global investors are looking for access to our market.
So it's a question of actually giving them that supply.
Look, I think
and that's a public issue.
Yeah, I think we need to see a lot more bravery about bringing assets up for sale, and a lot more leadership in terms of the sorts of reforms that will solve this problem.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what they do in the campaign. Brendan Lyon, thank you very much for joining us.
Good to be with you.